It's one of the unsolved mysteries of World War II. In an impeccably concealed hiding place, how did the Nazis discover Anne Frank and her family?
A new book reveals who Anne Frank's betrayer may have been. She was also the sister of the woman hiding the family.
In 1836, a haunting photograph of 5 sisters was taken, an image lost to time until recently uncovered by experts. At first glance, it seemed like just another relic of the past, but when they zoomed in, what they saw left them pale with shock. A chilling detail hidden in plain sight.
It's one of the most read, most studied books in history.
Was about to rewrite everything they thought they knew. Now, the question is, was there anything hidden far more than what the eyes can see? How terrifying was it? Stay tuned as we unravel the mystery behind this old photograph. You won't want to miss this. It was just past noon in the quiet town of Millbrook when a knock at Dr. Ethel Glenfield's office door changed everything. The day had started like any other, slow, uneventful, comfortingly predictable. A kettle of Earl Grey steamed gently on the windowsill while birds chirped softly outside. Inside the book-lined office, sunlight filtered through linen curtains, casting golden stripes across piles of archival folders and manuscripts. Dr. Glenfield, a respected historian known for her encyclopedic knowledge of early New England families, had just finished retelling a particularly amusing story about a Revolutionary-era scandal when the knock came. 3 soft raps that cut through the stillness like a call from the past. The door creaked open. A young dispatch writer stood stiffly in the hallway, holding a brown paper package with no return address. He offered little more than a shrug when Ethel asked his name. The moment the parcel was in her hands, a subtle shift filled the room. "Who is this from?" Dr. Ethel asked, her crisp smile fading as she signed for the package. The wrapping felt heavy despite its small size, and a faint scent of old cedar and dust clung to the paper. The messenger offered no answer and disappeared down the hallway before either historian could question him further. With a shared look of curiosity, she and Dr. Featherstone gathered around her desk. The silence grew, tight with the weight of expectation. The elderly doctor's hands trembled slightly as she peeled back the paper, revealing a gleaming daguerreotype, the earliest form of photograph, its silvered plate catching the light. The surface shimmered like liquid mercury, holding a century-old scene in its frozen grip. "It's from the local historical society," Dr. Featherstone read from a small note attached to the photo. "They want us to examine it. Something about an estate outside town." Dr. Ethel let out a shaky laugh, her nerves settling as she adjusted her wire-rimmed spectacles and held the plate up to the window. "I haven't seen one of these in years," she murmured. "Look at the condition, still intact, no tarnish around the edges." 5 young faces stared back from the image, their features frozen in time. It was a portrait of remarkable clarity. The girls, no older than 16, stood in a perfectly straight line, the background softly blurred in the way only daguerreotypes could render. Behind them, indistinct shapes suggested the outline of a wooden house and a sloping hill. A breeze must have passed just before the image was taken. The ends of a ribbon fluttered near one girl's sleeve. Ethel's breath caught. There was something hauntingly familiar about their faces, though she couldn't place it. A strange warmth bloomed in her chest, equal parts intrigue and unease. She reached for her magnifying glass, the metal cool in her hand, and began to study each girl one by one. The first, with brown hair in 4 reckless braids, wore a curious smile. Her dress was simple, but clean. There was a mischief in her eyes, a glint of humor that seemed to break through the camera's stern expectations. Next to her stood another girl with similar features, her smile more reserved, the two sharing a sisterly closeness. They leaned subtly toward one another, the way sisters often did when posing for long exposures. The middle girl was more serious, her honey-colored hair pulled into a loose bun, her posture tense, as if bracing for something unseen. Her eyes didn't quite meet the lens, They seemed to look through it, or perhaps beyond it. Beside her was a girl with nearly black hair, pulled tightly back, her eyes deep and watchful. She stood stiffly, hands clasped at her waist, her expression unreadable. There was something in her gaze, intelligent, almost defiant. But it was the last girl standing on the far right who captured Ethel's attention most. She smiled radiantly, her skin younger and fresher than the others, her hair in a messy but healthy bun. There was a gentleness in her posture, yet something else too, an inner strength maybe, or an innocence untouched by fear. Unlike the others, her eyes looked directly into the lens, confident and open. Ethel leaned in closer. Was it a trick of the light, or was her complexion slightly darker than her sister's? We're about to find out. Time seemed to slow. Ethel's historian instincts kicked in. Something about this family portrait didn't follow the norms of the 1830s, and yet it felt utterly sincere. There was an unspoken bond between the girls that transcended appearance. It was something intimate, fierce, and protective. She looked again at the note from the Historical Society, wondering if they had any idea what they were sending. But deep down, Ethel already sensed this wasn't just a photograph. It was a message, one that had waited over 180 years to be heard. "It looks like an assembly," Dr. Featherstone mused, peering over Ethel's shoulder. His voice was thoughtful, almost distant, as he traced the outline of the figures in the background. "You think there's something special about this?" Ethel set down her magnifying glass, overwhelmed. Her brow furrowed, eyes still locked on the faded photograph. "There's something about these faces," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Her voice carried a weight of intuition, more like a truth hovering just out of reach. The room was quiet except for the ticking of the old wall clock and the rustling of papers as they leaned closer to the image. For 2 hours, the pair pored over the daguerreotype, theorizing, debating, and examining every detail. They spoke in hushed tones, as if louder voices might disturb the lives frozen in the photograph. They studied the backdrop, a modest clapboard house, a field beyond it, a wooden bench with a worn blanket draped over it. It was Dr. Featherstone who made the first breakthrough. "I think these two are sisters," he said, pointing to the first and last girls. He leaned in closer, adjusting his glasses. "Look at their eyes, the shape, and the spacing, and their smiles. There's a shared softness." Ethel followed his gaze, nodding slowly. The resemblance was undeniable, but it was the tanned skin of the youngest girl that caught Ethel's eye, a hint of mixed race, rare in old America. Her features were delicate, but distinct. Not quite what one would expect in a portrait of a white abolitionist family in pre-Civil War New England. A memory flickered in Ethel's mind, something she'd read years ago in a footnote or an obscure reference book. Without a word, she rose quickly and pulled a thick volume from her bookshelf. Genealogical Histories of Millbrook Families, 1800 to 1900. The spine cracked as she opened it, dust rising into the dim air like the past refusing to be forgotten. Based on the girl's clothing and the photographic process, particularly the silver-plated surface and faint sepia wash, Ethel dated the image to the mid-19th century. Likely no later than 1840, certainly no earlier than 1835. She began her search there, flipping through pages of transcribed records, birth certificates, and family trees, her fingers moving with quiet urgency. And then she found it. The Clifton family, 5 daughters born between 1830 and 1833, Edna, Lucy, Mabel, Kate, and Rose. She read the names aloud, each one feeling eerily familiar. According to the records, the Clifton girls were well known for their kindness and their unusual family situation. Notes scribbled in the margins by a town archivist described them as musically gifted, deeply involved in charity, and early advocates for child welfare. Ethel's breath caught in her throat as she read the final entry. Rose, the youngest, had been adopted as an infant after her mother, a freed slave, died in childbirth. The record was matter of fact, but the implications were immense. The Cliftons, Quakers, and known supporters of the Underground Railroad had raised her as their own without secrecy or shame. In an era when even Northern tolerance was laced with prejudice, this choice was nothing short of revolutionary. Ethel's heart pounded. She returned to the daguerreotype and studied the faces anew. There was Edna's quiet strength, Lucy's solemn eyes, Mabel's half-smile, the inseparable closeness of the twins, and Rose, her expression unreadable but proud. The easy familiarity, the way they stood close together, arms barely touching but clearly united. It was all there. The girls weren't just sisters by blood, but by choice. She turned the page in the record book. Her eyes welled as she read the next entry. The Clifton family had been tragically lost in a house fire in the winter of 1847. All 5 daughters and their parents perished. The official cause was listed as chimney collapse, but the details were scarce. The community had been devastated. The girls were beloved for their charitable work and music, often performing together at church and community events. Multiple pages of tributes followed the quotes from local ministers, neighbors, and even children they had helped through the church's Sunday school initiative. Millbrook's Angels, one called them. Ethel looked again at the photograph, but it appears to be no longer just an image, but a memorial. Now the question is, what memorial? Hold on, because the plot twist is just around the corner. The weight of the discovery settled over the 2 historians like a heavy blanket. What had begun as an ordinary archival inquiry had become something far more profound. Here was a photograph of 5 young women who had lived, laughed, and loved together. Sisters, not just by blood, but by the radical compassion of their family. The photo was delicate, encased in a wooden frame, worn smooth by time. Ethel's fingers hovered just above the glass, as if afraid her touch might disturb the ghosts within. The air between her and Dr. Featherstone was still. No need for words. They were both beginning to sense that this image held something far larger than even history had previously acknowledged. Ethel's phone rang, its vibration startling them both. She glanced at the screen. It was Paloma McKinley from the Historical Society. "Doctor? Glenfield, have you had a chance to look at that photo we sent?" "Yes," Ethel replied, her voice thick with emotion. She hesitated, glancing at Dr. Featherstone as if seeking silent confirmation before continuing. "I believe we've discovered something remarkable. This isn't just any old photograph. It's a documentation of one of the most progressive families in Millbrook's history." There was a brief pause on the other end. Paloma was silent for a long moment. "My God," she finally whispered. "Do you realize what this means? We have photographic evidence of an integrated family from 1836, almost 30 years before the Civil War ended." Ethel swallowed hard, staring at the photograph with renewed focus. But as Ethel looked closer, she realized there was more to the story. It wasn't just the interracial family composition that stood out. The girls' faces were dirty, their clothing worn. Their dresses, though finely stitched, were smudged with what looked like soot or dried mud. There was a wildness to their hair, slightly windblown, uncombed, untamed. Their expressions were a mix of hope, sadness, and resolve. That resolve, that quiet defiance, told Ethel this was not simply a family portrait. It was something more urgent, more deliberate. She turned her magnifying glass to the background, narrowing her eyes at the hazy corners of the image. Slowly, the blurred figures of children became more distinct. 6, no, 8, more still. They too wore simple, worn clothes. Some sat on the ground, others stood close together, as if instructed to remain still. Their postures suggested something more organized than a casual gathering. "Featherstone," she whispered, "look at the children in the background. They're all about the same age." Dr. Featherstone leaned in, adjusting his glasses, his breath caught in his throat. The scene was subtle, almost imperceptible at first glance, but once noticed, it could not be unseen. The children weren't just present, they were central. Their presence shifted the entire context of the photograph. And then, near the corner of the plate, she saw it. Tiny, etched numbers. 8, 15, 18, 36. August 15th, 1836. She traced the etching with her fingertip. The numbers were small, so faint they might have been missed entirely by an untrained eye. It was the photographer's mark, which was often added to early daguerreotypes to record time and origin. Dr. Featherstone read aloud, his voice trembling. "That's more than a year before the fire. Why do they look so—" His voice trailed off as realization dawned. Ethel's mind raced. Something didn't add up. If this was just a family photo, why the need for documentation? Why the distinct date, the worn clothing, the presence of so many unrelated children? She turned to her laptop and searched the archives for local news from that time, her fingers flying over the keyboard with urgency. She sifted through brittle, scanned newspaper clippings, faded municipal records, and handwritten notes from Millbrook's early days. And there it was, buried deep within the pages of the Millbrook Herald, a report of a local Quaker family who had rescued 14 children from an illegal holding facility hidden just outside the township's borders. The piece was cautious, heavily redacted, likely to protect the family's identity. But there was one name that stood out, the Clifton family. Ethel read aloud, her voice tight with awe and disbelief. The girls had personally participated in the rescue, spending 3 days at the site caring for the traumatized children before authorities arrived. They had fed them, dressed their wounds, and even slept among them on makeshift bedding. The paper called them young angels in homespun. The photograph suddenly made perfect sense. The dirt, the clothing, the mix of emotions. They weren't poor children, but privileged young women who had risked everything to save others. The daguerreotype had been commissioned to document the rescue, serving as legal evidence in the trial that followed. And here it was, in Ethel's hands. Not just a photo, but a frozen moment of unspeakable bravery. But that's not all. Ethel's voice shook as she realized the truth. This isn't just a family photograph. It's evidence, legal documentation of one of the earliest recorded child trafficking rescues in American history. Those kids in the background were the children the Clifton sisters saved. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Dr. Featherstone sat heavily in his chair, the color draining from his face. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the photograph again, studying it now with a new urgency. The sepia-toned image, once just a curious relic from the past, now vibrated with a powerful energy. Truth, long buried, clawing its way to the surface. No wonder the Historical Society wanted this examined. "Do you think they knew?" he asked, almost in disbelief. "I don't think anyone knew the full story," Ethel replied, her voice firmer now as she scanned the crumbling parchment attached to the back of the photo. "Look at this. All 14 rescued children were placed with loving families. The illegal operation was shut down, and several arrests were made. The Clifton family's courage set a precedent for child welfare efforts that wouldn't be seen again for decades." She read the words aloud slowly, reverently, each syllable carving itself into the fabric of history. The document was unsigned but official, complete with a faint watermark of the early Massachusetts Child Protection Bureau, barely legible but unmistakable. It was dated just weeks after the trial that, until now, had gone unlinked to the Clifton name. The two historians sat in stunned silence, gazing at the photograph with new eyes. These 5 young women, the oldest barely 16, had risked everything to save children who had no one else, setting the stage for the orphanage system Millbrook would adopt years later. Outside the window, the quiet hum of Millbrook life continued as if nothing had changed. But in that small, book-lined office, the world had shifted. The past was no longer distant. It was alive, breathing, and demanding to be seen. Suddenly, Dr. Featherstone spoke. The fire. The house fire that killed them all in 1847. The words pierced the stillness like a knife. Ethel's heart sank as she dug deeper into the weathered file folder that had accompanied the photograph. She found a brittle newspaper clipping from the Millbrook Chronicle, dated December 4, 1847. The article described the tragic fire that engulfed the Clifton homestead, killing all 5 sisters instantly. But the final line chills her. Though declared accidental, some townsfolk whisper of darker motives. She cross-referenced court logs and handwritten sheriff's notes. The fire, it turned out, had been suspected arson, retaliation for the family's testimony in the trafficking trial. They were murdered, Ethel whispered. They saved those children and someone killed them for it. The room felt heavier now, burdened by injustice too long ignored. Tears pricked her eyes as she looked at the photograph one final time. In those young faces, she now saw not just 5 sisters, but 5 heroes, young women who sacrificed everything for love and justice. There was determination behind her sorrow. The photograph was not just evidence of an integrated family, but proof of the profound courage that defined America's hidden heroes. When she called Paloma back, Ethel's voice was steady despite her emotions. We need to prepare for something much bigger than we thought. What had begun as a curious investigation into a dusty old photograph had turned into a seismic revelation. The photograph would go on display as the centerpiece of a new exhibition. The Clifton Sisters, 1836, heroes of the Underground Railroad and pioneers of child welfare. Artifacts would accompany it, handwritten notes from the children, sketches of the old Clifton estate, trial documents, and a list of those arrested in the trafficking network. Museum curators from Boston and New York had already been alerted. News outlets were preparing to cover the story. The entire community of Millbrook, and perhaps the nation, would finally give the sisters the honor they'd been denied in life. And in the corner of the exhibit, barely visible unless you knew to look, were the names of 14 children whose lives began the day 5 brave sisters decided that love was stronger than fear. What a heartwarming story of courage and compassion. What do you think of the Clifton sisters' story? Do share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click on the following video showing